lesson 8 features the reasons for and the effects of rapid urbanization in the United States of America in the later part of the 19th, early part of the 20th century. So now we're kind of crossing over and focusing very specifically on the sort of late part of the 19th century. We're looking at sort of the entire Gilded Age, that period up into the First World War. So what are the realities of late 19th century urbanization? Of course, the growth of urban centers are inextricably linked with immigration. Around half of the new city residents come from the rural USA, the other half are immigrants. And we see the population of America jump dramatically, okay, in terms of how many people move from urban to rural centers. Now, in big cities, cities over 100,000 people grow dramatically. In 1860, only 9 cities can claim to have 100,000 people. By 1900, 38 American cities. The American writer Booth Tarkington will talk about a deteriorating social order caused by urbanization and industrialization, and I guess we're going to establish whether or not that is true. So what are the causes of urbanization? Let's start first. The biggest one, of course, is immigration. Chicago and New York, 40% are foreign-born by 1890. New York, that number gets up as high as 80% by 1910. Another major reason for urbanization are technological advances. It's just more plausible. High-speed elevators allow for skyscrapers built of steel to be built, and as people can grow up, cities don't have to necessarily grow out, and the population density that can live within a small area of land can increase dramatically. Not only that, inventions around moving people around, such as the electrified streetcar. Later on, by the early part of the 19th century, the underground subway system will allow cities to have a whole bunch of people in a densely packed area and not allow for gridlock and over congestion, because you can start to move people underground or move people above ground with greater efficiency. Another point is, of course, the continuing decline of rural America. We've seen already how the plight of farm workers increases throughout the latter part of the 19th century. And with the decline in rural America, the problems that farm workers have, you get high birth rates in rural areas, but also less demand for work. It used to be that you had lots of children in farming communities and in farming families because you needed the extra hands on the farm. Now, at this particular time, agricultural mechanization comes in. That is, it reduces the demand for farm workers. You no longer need 10 people to plow a field. If a tractor with one person driving it can do it for you. Additionally, farm failures. There are the crises and panics that are experienced by America in the 1870s and the 1890s will lead a lot of farmers to go bankrupt, particularly those that had borrowed lots of money to invest in their farms, to invest in tractors and so on and so forth. These people go bankrupt and as a result end up moving to the cities for work. Last point is something known as the Jim Crow laws. The Jim Crow laws were laws passed in the southern states that not only disenfranchised, took away the right to vote, but made black people less than citizens. The Jim Crow laws will allow for segregation. Okay, black only drinking fountains, black only schools, which are dramatically underfunded, and the fact that blacks in the United States then lose their ability to be counted as a human. In fact, a black man is only counted as 3/5 a man in the United States thanks to the Jim Crow laws.
So I'm going to talk about housing and sanitation and public health. Before we look at these sort of bullet points, though, the most important thing to realise is where people go wrong on this essay is they don't know how to explain how you get from urbanisation or rapid people going into these cities to these problems. They can mention there was urbanisation and that there were these problems, but they don't get the A&A stars by explaining the link. And the reason is thus. Okay, if you put a lot of people in a small into a small amount of area, the demand for land it gets higher because you have more people wanting land. Okay, you have more people wanting housing. So therefore, the amount, if you are a landlord, you can charge for a flat goes up. So then some families who are poorer will have to share flats, and flats will have to get smaller. As well as that, part of the big thing we need to think about is if you slowly increase a population, 10,000 every 10 years, houses can get built, roads can get upgraded, sewers, water can all get upgraded in time. If you have a rapid urbanization where tens of thousands of people are arriving almost on an annual basis, you don't have the time to build that infrastructure, those new houses. And so the people have to make do in the same areas with the types of houses, the number of houses, the quality of infrastructure, the quality and amount of sewage supply, water supply, etc., that was designed for far fewer people. So in the housing case, what we see is poor people need to be relatively close to their work. There's not really mass car usage. There's not underground and many railways which poor people can afford. So therefore, you have a factory and the land around them. You have loads and loads and loads of people who want to live nearby so they can work. Now, naturally, there's not enough space. So either the old houses get converted and split rather than selling whole houses or even flats. You just sell rooms or even parts of rooms, which leads to massive overcrowding. These houses were already poorly designed, and by being used by so many more people than they were designed, they get run down very quickly. As well as that, enterprising people buy small plots of land and design tall, high, crammed-in housing called tenements in these areas. And you can see the statistics there about all the details and why that's so bad. The key thing to point out for your analysis, though, is this is what happens when you have a concentration of people very rapidly, and there is not the speed to provide services, railways, etc., but also new housing to actually fit these people in. And partly as well because when you have no rules about how you can treat your tenants, what sort of housing is acceptable, the people will naturally make it as bad as possible to make the most amount of money. And as mentioned at the bottom, there is some changes to the law. The Tenement Housing Law 1901 makes some rules about what should happen to the housing, what quality of housing, how many people per room, whether it should have water and toilets. In reality, though, as we shall see when we get onto the progressive era, even though laws were made, very often landlords could bribe their way or get political favour so that they don't actually have to follow the law here. So in housing terms, therefore, it's overcrowded and poor quality. A similar story we see in terms of sanitation and public health. There is a ton of facts there. You can read those at your own leisure. I will explain to you simply why this happens. So, if you put a sewer underground, that takes time and money. Okay, you design it for X amount of people. Say you have a population in New York of 100,000. If suddenly you have 1 million people in New York in 10, 20, 30 years, you do not have the time or the money to invest in sewers, in water supplies, in roads, in more schools, in more hospitals, what we describe as infrastructure, to accommodate that many people. So then you have 1 million people using pipes, using schools designed for 1/10 the number of people. And therefore, when you have all these people with poor sanitation, poor water, poor medical care, and also being overcrowded, as mentioned before, in these housing, you see a massive outbreaks of disease, particularly diseases to do with sewage getting into water, cholera, typhoid, or ones to do with close conditions and poor conditions, damp housing such as tuberculosis. And as you can see all the way through there, and I'm gesturing into it, you can't see it, there are all the statistics to say it was bad, man, it was bad. There were, however, some improvements. If you look at the bottom, they do build over time, particularly towards the 1900s. In the early years, less so, to try and improve the level of water, clean water, and sewer provision. But even in the 1900s, it wasn't enough.
Okay, the next one is crime. Let me break it down like this. Okay, when you have poor people in an area, there will be an increase in criminality. And that's not to say that poor people are criminals, but you have the certain natural sociological things happen. Number one, there's what's sometimes known as Robin Hood crime. There's the stealing to feed yourself. Okay, so the crimes that are necessary crimes or justified as necessary by many, I need to do this because if I don't take X thing, I won't eat. Okay, there's that. Secondly, the other one is a more of an interesting sociological phenomenon. That is the fact that when people are exploited, when you have people cramped in neighborhoods, when these people are impoverished, they do not accept their lot in life, and they are consistently looking for ways to make themselves better. And when these ways don't necessarily easily appear to them, i.e. that there's a lack of hope, people will tend to join organizations that give them at least the best solution to their problem. And what we have, okay, is exploitation of immigrants in the inner cities, particularly in areas like New York and Chicago, which forces them into gangs, or what's sometimes known as organized crime syndicates, mafia organizations that offer them a solution, a way to make money that isn't necessarily above board or legal, which is very always illegal, doing things and committing crimes, but it allows them a chance for advancement. It gives them a sense of hope, it gives them a sense of purpose, but at the same time, it also is criminal. You also have, and as a third part of this, a natural attachment to crime from the old country. A really and probably the most profound example of that is the Italians. In Italy, where these similar problems had existed, the mafia in southern Italy provided a solution for many. And when these people come over from southern Italy and places like Sicily, they simply bring the mafia with them. And the mafia moves into the inner cities of America and finds it incredibly lucrative. In fact, it's infinitely more lucrative because America is infinitely more rich than Italy to operate a mafia organization, an organized crime organization in the cities. So crime increases out of, in some cases, necessity, in other cases, due to cultural bringing it with it culturally from the other country, but also because it does provide people with a degree of hope.
And absolutely, one thing to add to that is very similar to the other 2 points I just made. The infrastructure, in this case, the number of police officers, does not scale with the number of people you have. If you have fewer people, particularly if you have lots more poor people coming in, but you don't have the number of police officers to match that, naturally there's going to be more crime. And that's partly because these cities, being American, do not like to tax and have big government.
Okay. On the other side, what are the effects of urbanization? Now, there are obviously massive economic benefits. Number one, large cities are incredibly beneficial for industrial growth. We sort of know this already. One of the major growths of industry is population growth. Anytime there's a huge centralized growth of people who aren't farming for themselves, you need to provide them with food and all of the stuff they can't make for themselves. So the centralized resources allows for industrial growth. Not only that, the fact you have large clusters of people means you have large groups of people with diverse skills that can be called upon for building or for employing new industries, et cetera, et cetera. Not only that, large cities are more conducive to hubs of transportation. Okay, they create these sort of large interconnected networks where trains and boats and stuff can go into and out of, and it's economically viable to have these large transportation hubs, which increase the ability for the goods produced in that city to spread out to other countries and other areas of your own country and vice versa. And they also, of course, facilitate the rapid exchange of information. By their very nature, cities force people together. And when people are forced together, though you may not realize it or not, you share ideas. You bump into someone at a coffee shop, sometimes you strike up a conversation, things can go from there. But more particularly, if you're interested in something, you can easily find other people with like interests, and your interests can feed off each other, and cities end up being real expanders and engines of economic growth because they facilitate information, what's known as agglomeration economics. There are also economic costs. Number one, cities do perpetuate economic inequality. Anytime there's a large group of people ready to be exploited, there is always people who will do the exploiting. And therefore, the rich very much always get richer and the poor generally stay poor. And one good example, 9% of families owned 71% of the country's wealth in 1892.
So, this next one is very, very hard. I'm actually going to spend a little bit of a while explaining it. The first thing to realise is politics in the this Gilded Age is more complicated. Back before the Civil War, it's crude to say, but it's broadly true. If you wanted to be a politician, you went around to the local area, the local market, you did something called a stump speech, which means you sort of stand on top of a box or something, a bit ad hoc, a bit random, and you give a speech, and the people might believe in you, and they might vote for you, and they might not. In the era of mass urbanisation, where the population density is so huge, and it's impossible for you to personally talk to even families or groups, large groups of people, and many of these areas are deeply unsafe for you to go into, it's much harder for you to get your message out there and to get control. So if you want to get your vote out, you have to turn to something called the ideas of mass politics. This is the idea that you don't convert people to your cause by meeting them, shaking their hand and persuading them. You do it through, like today, big messaging, sending out campaigners, sending out people on your behalf. This leads to bossism. This basically means you have politicians, say, Sir, Mr. Rain wants to be a state congressman or congressman for Manhattan, for example. And he needs the votes of the Italians, he needs the votes from the Poles, he needs the votes from the Russians to get those people, to get that. Now, in reality, there's no way he speaks any of those languages. He's not going to go into any of those areas. He's terrified he'll be killed. But what he can do is ask a middleman, ask people who have contacts or friends in these areas to help turn out the vote. And better than even persuading the Italians, they'll buy off the Italians to make sure the Italians vote 97% of the time for you. So what happens is, in the New York case, Tammany Hall, which is on the list there, Boss Plunkett, would say to a congressman who wants to be a congressman for a certain area in New York, if you have to pay me X amount or give me this many government jobs, I'll keep some of that for myself. And I'll give the rest of it out to these different areas, the Italian quarter, the Jewish quarter, the Russian quarter, the Irish quarter. And with that money, we'll make sure they'll vote your way. That is boss politics. So there's three parts. The bosses are not politicians. They are people you hire to get the vote. You have the politicians at the top, the bosses who make it happen, and the people who turn out to vote when they're paid $1 or they're given a pint of beer or whatever it happens to be, or a government job in certain cases. So the question is, why does urbanizations lead to bosses? The reasons are threefold. Number one, there is a void of the state. If with the increase in population, most of whom are poor and therefore don't pay taxes, the government cannot possibly look after everyone's health, sanitation, well-being and education. In that gap, the local people, the local bosses in the Italian quarter can provide you, say your granny's sick, with granny with some healthcare benefits, or a little bit of money on the side if you're unemployed. In return, though, you owe the boss your vote, and more importantly, you owe the boss your apartment blocks vote, or your boss's church vote. Through the absence of the state, people depend on bosses to get stuff to help them get by, like educational opportunities, like jobs, like welfare, like healthcare handouts. Nothing huge, but it's better than nothing. And as already mentioned before about immigration, these people, many of them don't value the vote or don't see the virtue of the vote compared to just the money or their survival. I'm more than happy to do it. So the void of the state means, which happens in rapid urbanization because it's so big, it's so hard to give everyone what they need, means that bosses have a way in. As well as that, as mentioned, because of the mass urbanization, the politicians cannot get their message out normally, they cannot get it out through speaking. So in the era of mass politics, they need someone to turn the vote out, to spread the message, to make sure people vote their side. They're nowhere going to go anywhere near these dangerous quarters. Again, you need bosses, and that's why the second reason we see the rise of bosses, the era of mass politics and the demands of mass politics. The last one is more simple. In rapid urbanization, you go from a period where everyone knows everyone keeps an eye on everyone, to people not knowing what happens 2 blocks away, because that's the Jewish area, the Irish area, and you don't go in there because you're not Jewish and or Irish. Okay, what that means is you can get away with a lot of corruption and buying the votes in the anonymity of the city. By having rapid urbanization and ghettoization as a result, it is easier for bosses to do corrupt practices. If you're in some village down in Pennsylvania and I pay you for a vote, someone else is going to see that. The middle class lawyer in the town will see that and will look down upon me. The middle classes aren't going anywhere near these ghettos. The middle classes aren't going anywhere near these poor areas. You can get away with a lot and they won't hear about it. And the thing that reverses this, when journalists start to go into this, but we'll look into that later.
Okay, so the last effect, still on the political effect, is that the whole nature of urbanization will change the political landscape of America. It will usher in what is known as the progressive movement. This unit is called the Gilded Age and then the progressive movement. It is a movement in politics that originates in the latter part of the 19th century and will become very powerful in the early part of the 20th century. The progressive movement is a movement, particularly among the Democratic Party of America, that's aimed at changing and fixing all of the problems caused by the Gilded Age: mass industrialization, mass immigration, mass urbanization. Okay, this corrupt, this ineffective local government brought about by large-scale immigration will create an impetus for change. People will realize that bossism is out of control and that we need to change the political system and the sort of the way politics is done in America to address these fundamental problems. Okay, you get a whole bunch of reformers popping up at the end of the 19th century who will become influential in what we will later study as the progressive movement. And they come up as a result. The first one is Theodore Roosevelt. He was governor of New York. New York City, the heartbeat of New York, the biggest city, is within his jurisdiction. He saw for himself the corruption of the bosses, and he begins to call for greater transparency into the political process to try and break the power of these individuals who are exploiting the people in the city because nobody can see what they're up to. So he needs to greater transparency and greater understanding of the political process. This will usher in, of course, this progressive era of the 20th century, which we'll talk about at length a little bit later on. So how bad were conditions in industrial cities? Let's get evaluative. Number one, they were bad, but they do get better by the early progressive era. Here's what's bad about them. Number one, growth on a large scale puts immense pressure on the conditions in the city. The tenements, they're close to industrial areas, which meant they were unsanitary. And we have lots of reasons and lots of examples of unsanitary in this lesson. They were drunk and disorderly. Crime was high because of a lack of policing and the densely populated nature and the organization of crime. Disease is widespread because not only were its causes little understood, little action is actually taken to prevent disease. Water is not purified, sanitation isn't taken care of, etc., etc. On the other hand, there were some good improvements. The middle class, if you're able to achieve that level, start to live in less crowded apartments. Life isn't necessarily so bad. Though city mortality rates stay high, advances in medicine are starting to be made around the turn of the century, around 1900. People learned, for instance, that germs cause disease rather than sort of polluted atmosphere. They used to call it the noxious atmosphere. So people would walk around with masks thinking that this would cure them from things like cholera, when in fact it was a germ-bound disease, something you can get from drinking contaminated water, etc., etc. And this will lead to improvements once people know how diseases are caused, they know how to fix it. The second thing, of course, cities will pass laws to impose controls on tenements. They'll make, for instance, it illegal to have a building without running water, or illegal to have a building without a WC in it. The progressive movement, of course, as I mentioned, will emerge, and it will start to draw attention to the terrible conditions. Mr. Suter mentioned the fact that journalists become really the impetus for the progressive movement. They'll go into these tenements, they'll start reporting on the horrible way people are living, which is shocking to a lot of Americans. The most famous of them all was a man named Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis will basically show, with his sort of photo documentaries, if you will, that 80% of the 1.5 million people living in New York City are living in these horrible, overcrowded tenements. And the progressives that sort of follow on from this will start to undertake philanthropic work. They'll give back. Jane Addams leads what's known as the Hull House Project in Chicago, which provides sanitary housing for the poor and ensures that people have access to things like shower and baths and so on and so forth. City governments will also begin to slowly improve infrastructure and take steps to sort of regulate the tenements and the corruption.
Okay, so in terms of the slums and the ghettos, how do they manage to deal with these? Obviously, one thing we need to make clear is a slum is a poor area, an area where there's lots of concentrated people, poor immigrants or poor whoever they happen to be, lots of crime, lots of poor health. A ghetto is an area where you have loads of people of the same ethnic group in one area, such as Little Italy, in New York, etc., etc. It can be poor, and often they are because immigrants are poor, but you can have a ghetto, but which isn't as bad as a slum, and you can have a slum which is much worse than a ghetto. Okay, so the difference is all in: is there a concentration of one type of people, or not? If it's not, and it's poor, it's a slum. If it is, it's a ghetto. So this is obviously what happens, as mentioned, with immigration, where immigrants come to and then stay with their friends or their extended family because otherwise it's a strange new country, etc., etc., etc. In order to, the city's response is varied, and the key sort of thing to realise about these sort of questions is, in reality, some cities are more progressive. New York City, for example, does more about this than others, say Chicago, or even some of the smaller cities. And we see very little of this sort of stuff in the South, for example, for what they have, what passes for cities in those areas, such as Austin, etc. Okay. But they design tenement buildings, they try and develop sanitation, they try and deal with the disease, but ultimately, as mentioned, they fail. Okay? They do little to address, partly because the bosses control the local government. Congressmen care about going to Congress, going to Washington, and getting bribes on a national scale. They do not care about policy on the local level. So what they very often do is they trade votes for the bosses having control of the sanitation, the police of a particular area. Additionally, the people who pay for these things are not the immigrants. They don't get taxed at all, if any. It is middle classes. The middle classes, this is America, do not like getting taxed to pay for someone else's welfare. Okay, remember all the stuff we looked at about values. In reality, they're not going to pay for too much. So the city government doesn't have the money, doesn't have the power, and really doesn't really have the intent to do it. Particularly, remember, many of these cities are Republicans. Republicans tend to be laissez-faire, so therefore they have their attitude against it. There's a slight exception from New York City where they tend to be a bit more interventionist, a bit more of a state response. This does change, however, in the 1890s with the rise of progressive movement and the rise of particular politicians such as Roosevelt in New York, as mentioned, Pingree in Detroit, as mentioned. We see people who politicians who make their name by improving people's lives, and that also means fighting corruption, who are stopping that improvement in people's lives. As well as that, as journalists, particularly the mark-creation journalists, as mentioned, bring attention. There's more government money, there's more government pressure on the government from voters to get this sorted. So we do see a slight improvement as time goes on, but in reality, it is still nowhere near good enough in this regard.
Okay, a couple last quick points. There are lots of economic problems throughout the Gilded Age, economic crashes. We'll talk about those in later lessons. And the idea that the U.S. economy was prone to flash crises and recessions will halt the degree and the effectiveness of industrial cities in dealing with this social and economic problems. And although, cities do respond, one might say the best response that most cities can do is allow people to escape them. The move to the suburbs takes the strain off the cities and allows the cities a little bit of breathing room to sort of deal with the overall problem. So overall, city authorities don't do a heck of a lot in the 19th century to alleviate, say, the social and economic problems in their cities. They would do so later on under progressive leadership in the early 20th century. So there's a little bit of nuance. In the 19th century, no, but in the early 20th century, yes. And overall, the endless flows of immigrants, which are coming year upon year upon year upon year, actually do more to hurt the growth or the fixing of the social problems. They allow people to continuously fill the tenements, to continuously feed the government bosses who are always looking for new ways of corrupting and exploiting the people, and the problems effectively remain. So for all of the good, effectively, not much is done, because for everyone you help, and two new people move in. So what do historians say? John Telford will say that American city government from 1870 to 1900 was an unheralded triumph. In America's city, the supply of water was the most abundant. The parks, i.e. Central Park in New York, was created, and the public transportation the fastest of any place in the world. However, contradict that, James Bryce will say city government was one of the most conspicuous failures of the entire United States of America. And that's all we have. We'll talk about a lot of these things, particularly bosses and so forth, and other lessons in a lot more detail. But most certainly you have to understand how synoptically they can work across various topics.
Bye.